Welcome to the Adventures Club of Los Angeles, where for the last 100 years we have been gathering and celebrating those who venture off the beaten path. And tonight we have a fantastic guest, Adam Ravetch, who for the last 30 years has been the premier cinematographer in the Arctic and filming new animal discoveries both above the ice and below the ice. And just as a note, I'm Lance Miller. I'm a member of the board of directors here, and I'm pleased to welcome Adam for tonight's show. Adam, welcome to the Adventures Club.
It's great to be here. Good to see all of you.
Now, I think to get things rolling, we have a little video just to warm things up, don't we?
Little tease just to show you what I've been up to for the last few years. Roll it, Phoebe.
Thank you, Adam. That was a great show. Did you guys like it? I'm glad you came tonight. I mean, after that, what else do we need to see, right?
I think the bear was saying crunchy on the outside, chewy on the inside.
Oh, okay, I got you. One of our favorite Far Side cartoons, of course.
Yeah.
So, Adam, you're a guy that grew up in the San Fernando Valley.
Yep.
Not exactly the mecca of adventure and Arctic exploration. So let's go back and bring everybody sort of up to speed on how you got here tonight and how you got into your profession. So tell us a little bit about growing up in the San Fernando Valley, and what was your inspiration to sort of find this path that you wound up on in life?
Well, first I just want to make a shout out to my high school buddy, Mike Stevens. Everybody says this has kind of been my dream that I've been living, but the truth is, if I spent a little more time with him, I might have become a professional baseball player. It might not match to what I've done, but it would have been a good thing. Anyway, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, which in the summer times it was 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm really happy my mother put a swimming pool in because it became the center of my universe. My first ocean expeditions were in the pool. The pool sweep was a giant octopus. The little portals were entrances to caves. My patio furniture was shipwrecks full of gold. My dad was an amateur cameraman. He had an 8mm camera, and he used to hold these boo and hiss nights. He said, Adam, if you ever make a film, you got to show it to people. And so he would show it, and if you didn't like it, you would boo and hiss, and if you liked it, you would cheer. So I'm hoping tonight there'll be more cheers than boo and hisses.
Well, we'll see. Now, I understand you actually got a large inheritance from your grandmother.
Yeah.
And that's actually what sort of set things in motion for you, right?
Yeah, I wasn't a starving filmmaker. My grandmother gave me $100. and my parents, I was 13 years old, and my parents said, get whatever you want. And I said, I want scuba gear, because I was following Jacques Cousteau and Sea Hunt series. And they said, get whatever you want but scuba gear. And so I had to wait a little bit. I had to wait, yeah.
Okay. And then, so you're going along, and you wind up in probably the premier scuba center of the world at that point, which is San Diego, which you're going to college. Take us through that time and that effect that had on you at that point.
I randomly ended up at San Diego State University, but it was where the birth of scuba diving happened in North America. It was one of the main centers. And it started in the 1930s during the Depression. There was this club that you see on the screen here. All these men with the fish there were called the bottom scratchers. There were 18 of them. They had these wild names. One guy was called Walrus. One was Frog Kicker. The guy in the middle, his name is Wally Potts. He could hold his breath for 5 minutes, so they called him One Long Dive. And they basically were trying to feed their families, but they also designed dive gear. And they were the first natural people to exchange their spear gun for a camera, and they became the first underwater cinematographers. And Phoebe, if you go to the next slide, there's this guy, and his name is Connie Limbaugh. And in 1950, Jacques Cousteau brought the aqualung to Los Angeles, and he was a student at UCLA. He took the aqualung, he went to Scripps Institute in San Diego, and he was one of the first scientists to start filming and studying the kelp forests of San Diego. He also worked with the Navy, and he produced the first public organized scuba diving course that became NAUI and PADI. And I ended up there 20 years later, and I was at San Diego State that had 7 dive courses. I basically majored in scuba diving, even though that wasn't a major. And I became a dive instructor, and I started teaching. I just fell in love with diving. The only thing I wanted to do was be in the water. So.
And then I think you were saying that you actually were a dive master in, of all places, Saudi Arabia, which had to be in the 80s, had to be quite an adventure at that time, because it was still very strict and Islamic from that standpoint. It wasn't really an open nation at that point as much as it is now.
The people that taught me how to dive had a contract for Aramco, and so they sent me to Saudi Arabia. I was raised Jewish. You couldn't be a Jew in Saudi Arabia because all the maps had a felt mark over Israel, so it didn't exist. You couldn't say you're agnostic or I forget exactly. So I had to say I was Christian, basically, to get into the country. But that was a great adventure. I was in charge of I was 22. I was in charge of 250 students from 17 to 35. And I taught every level of diving. And I went to Riyadh. I went to the Red Sea in Jeddah. And it was just a really great experience. So.
You're fantastic. You came back to the U.S., and then there was this was amazing, because you had quite an adventure at Mount St. Helens after Mount St. Helens exploded. And it's interesting how these brushes with we'll say the spectrum of religion sort of were touching you at this point in your life. So fill us in on Mount St. Helen and your experience with that.
Well, I was kind of freelancing as a scuba instructor in San Diego while I finished my degree, and I was given 4 students that were from a creationist college. But they had all gotten their degrees at Penn State, so they were geologists, and one of them had challenged the view that coal formed underneath peat swamps, and it took 1,000 years, and that was his theory. And what happened was, right at that moment, Mount St. Helens blew, and they basically hired me to be their dive master, because Mount St. Helens is at 7,000 feet. It's altitude diving, has a special table unto itself, and in a matter of 6 minutes, there was a blast that was like 20,000 Hiroshima bombs. It leveled 150 square miles of forest, and there was an 850-foot wave on Spirit Lake, which was at the base of Mount St. Helens, and it just took all those logs, put them back in the water, and they formed coal in 6 minutes. And so, as a creationist, it proved his theory that Earth was only 6,000 years old, and catastrophic events created everything that we know to be. And at night, they would have services to try to convert me, but I stayed with the dive tables. I was having trouble. I got to figure out the altitude.
It sounds like another great adventure.
Yeah.
Another great adventure.
Another great adventure.
So what was going on that started to take you into, let's say, diving and on the path you're moving on right now? And did we even have a brush with Jaws at that point, I think, that came up?
Well, I wanted to be a diving safety officer, but there were only like 6 jobs, and nobody quit. You know, they kept in that job forever. And so there was only one job opening. I lost out to a guy with a master's master's degree. So everybody suggested I go get a master's degree, and when I was growing up in the San Fernando Valley, Jaws came out, and I was part of that phrase, or the word that they coined, blockbuster. Blockbuster was coined with Jaws, Spielberg's Jaws, from all the people that lined up around the block, and I saw it 8 times in a row. I went to the theater, and then when I went to get my master's degree, I sought out the man that's on the screen. His name is Dr. Don Nelson, and his lab was researched for the Richard Dreyfuss character because he was the expert shark researcher on the West Coast. And he was the first to challenge the scientific view that sharks were unpredictable killing machines. And he actually found that certain sharks have personalities, kind of like people. Not all of them bite. And he also found out of a shark that would actually warn you before they would bite you. And the way he figured that out is he would swim with the shark, and it would do this pronounced behavior where it put its pectoral fins down, it arched its back, and it swam in a big figure 8. And if you didn't stop swimming after it, it would eventually bite you. And he actually got bit, and that's how it started. And then he went back to this island where he discovered this. He used that submarine, and he went and got bit about 50 times, but the shark bit his submarine. And then when he came back, all these film crews came to interview him. So I went from being a graduate student to a production grunt. And that's when I decided I really wanted to make the switch into filmmaking.
And I think he also, you've shared with me, gave you sort of the vision for what you needed to do as a filmmaker.
There were 2 things that really has, I think, been impacted my journey. One is Don always said, fine, be a scientist, or sorry, be a filmmaker if you want to go into that field, but always be a scientist with your camera. So the whole goal is always to push knowledge forward. And then I had an aunt and uncle that were Hollywood screenwriters, and I was very captivated with narrative conventions, making stories using narrative filmmaking tools, but with natural history. And so by discovering new behavior, you get to add knowledge to the Natural History Archive, but you also get a brand new story. And so those 2 things of what sort of driven me for the last 25, 30 years.
So let's move to your first ice dive. How did that come about? Where was it? And what was the experience to actually dive under the ice for the first time?
I worked for a guy who we mostly did tropics. He trained me as an underwater cinematographer for 4 years. And he was from Toronto, and he felt bad that he never did a Canadian show. And so we went to the place where all the harp seals are pupped every year in March. It was made famous in the 1960s by Brigitte Bardot, trying to stop people from clubbing the white babies over the head and taking their fur. But by the time I was there in the late 80s, they were still kind of conservation groups about that, but that was the area that we went. And when you go March 1st, there are thousands and thousands of harp seals. My first ice dive was also my first dry suit dive. You can see on the screen that's a dry suit. Many of you maybe have been in a wetsuit. A wetsuit, the water goes in, and that layer of water warms up against your body. Your body will warm that water, and that's what keeps you warm. But in 29-degree Fahrenheit water, which is the temperature that I was diving into, you would last about 5 minutes, so you need a dry suit. But when you first dive with a dry suit, it's like a big Ziploc baggie, so you've trapped air inside the suit. You need lots of weight to get down. I didn't wear enough weight. The suit leaked, and I found myself, I went into and I had my camera trying to make shots, and I was underneath the ceiling of the ice, kind of buoyed up. And there was a baby white seal, because when they're brand new and they get in the water, they have fat, and they're buoyed up. And there I was face to face with the white seal, trying to make a shot, but I just wasn't steady. And what happens also at the ceiling, if your exit hole is over there, you have to dive down to look up to find it. You can't see it at the ceiling when you're flush. So I barely made it out that day. I was crawling out of the ice hole, and my boss at the time, the guy that trained me, took one look at me and said, "You can handle it." And then he walked away. And I'd been with him for 4 years. He wasn't a really nice guy.
Well, a couple things. First of all, this is, I think, what, the St. Lawrence ice pack? Well,
yes, this is pack ice, so this is ice that is not attached to anything. It's constantly drifting and moving. But they're huge sheets, so you can't really tell that they're moving all the time. So you have to be careful when you dive also underneath the ice there, because at 1 minute you could look up and your exit hole is there, and the next second it could be gone.
So
Yeah.
what I'm curious about, and we haven't really gotten into this, what was it like? It's like 25 below zero on the surface. you're looking at a hole you're going to jump into 29-degree water. Do you recall what was going through your mind at that point? You've got to be freezing on the surface the way it was. I mean,
well, why don't we show them?
Okay.
Maybe play the clip. As Lance was alluding to, it's in this location, it's March, it's 25 below zero on the surface, and we go through seal holes that are 30 inches in diameter. What I'm thinking about then is really, it's always about the shot. It's actually a great distraction to have your camera and shoot animals that not many people knew about. But the problem, again, with pack ice is that it's constantly moving and shifting. And if you don't watch out, you could easily lose your exit hole. Even if you're attached to the surface by a rope, that could take you away with the sheet of ice. So in the beginning, there were some times when the holes almost closed on us. So.
Well, no, you were telling me that the hole closed and they were pushing the ice axe through and you pushed the camera up. And I mean, some of these stories, you're lucky that you're sitting here with us today. Yeah.
Well, there was one day where we had a blizzard, and it was, usually I bring 4 tanks. A helicopter would drop you off with a beacon so they knew where to pick you up. You take 4 Snicker bars, and you would make 4 dives. And the great thing about that, in the beginning, I didn't have to sleep outside in 25 below zero. So you always thought about that night you get back to the hotel. But this day it was a blizzard, and there was a hole open about the size of a pool. Imagine, and it was full of seals. There was like 300 seals in it. So I always would bring about 3 regulators, because the other problem that can happen when it's 25 below zero, your regulator can actually freeze up when you inhale. There's moisture in your breath, and the crystals can form, and the regulator can freeze open, which just means your air is continuously running out and your tank just goes down. So when you're under the ice, you don't want your regulator to freeze open. And if you do, you have to get back very quickly. But so I had 3 regulators, and I went into the water, and my first regulator froze. And by the time I got my second regulator together, now the hole was about the size of 3 jacuzzis. But still, all these animals were bobbing and weaving in there, and I was just dying to get under to get the shot. And then again, my second regulator froze. So by the time I got my last regulator, the hole had shut. And so we had blown the day. There was not going to be any diving, but we made our way back to where all our gear was, and a seal popped up in a seal hole. And I looked at my guide, and he looked at me, and I said, okay, let's do it. So I went down the hole. And because the current was strong with the wind, I went attached with the rope, and all those animals that were there were right underneath that ice right there. So as far as my eye could see, I was filming these harp seals. And all of a sudden, though, I feel a yank, and I'm being now towed along the surface of the ice, pulled back to the hole, and basically bouncing off the ceiling. And as I got back to the hole, I looked up, and kind of in that last shot there, you saw that it was mush. There was no definitive hole to get out of. And I could see my guy above. He brought an axe for safety, which was great, and he was just jamming the axe and trying to keep the hole open. So I swam up, I handed my camera through the mush, he grabbed the camera out, and then I pushed my way out, and I got kind of halfway, and he kept jamming the axe around me and opening it, and then when I crawled out, the hole collapsed. So it's good I'm here. It's good that that I made it out, but I learned a lot. You constantly learn, especially if you're from Los Angeles. You have a lot to learn in the Arctic.
So I think we have some video on this too. There's a difference between pack ice and land ice, and also the thickness of the holes you have to actually. It's not like you just go out and chop a hole in the ice and go for a dive. This is like building a log cabin to get a hole in the ice.
Right. Well, Phoebe, why don't you play the next clip, and we'll. For over 20. Play the next clip.
Is that the one? I don't think so.
No. Go ahead, you can stay here. Just why don't you play the next clip? What Lance is referring to is there's the pack ice that's constantly floating that we showed you, and in this next still, it's something called land-fast ice. And to get through land-fast ice, that's ice that's actually heavy with snow on top of it, and it's attached to the land. If you can show the next slide, Phoebe. And this was the first place I sort of went diving in the high Arctic. One thing when I filmed the seals, I was very taken by and heard about that there was a lot of animals in the north that were sort of undercovered. And Don Nelson, my mentor, when I was getting my master's degree, he was kind of in my head about pushing knowledge forward, and that's why I went north, because I heard of sort of prehistoric sharks that existed. There were toothwalkers, there were sea unicorns, and so anyway, so this was the first dive that I made, and that ice goes right up to the land. There's snow on top, so in this case, you just have to chisel your way through it to dive underneath it, but you don't have to worry so much about it floating away. Show the next slide, please. And maybe the next slide. We're going backwards. And that wall that you saw, the cliff, it extends down, and surprisingly, there's a lot of life that exists under the ice. Keep going. It takes about 2.5 days to chisel your way through. Next slide. And so this is a good just shot to show you how the ice kind of really goes right up against into the shallows, like in 5 feet of water there. And as long as it's spring, and from winter to spring, and it doesn't get below zero, above zero, then you're pretty much okay. You just have to remember where your exit hole is. Next slide. And the next slide. So there were a lot of animals that I heard about. And in 1995, I went with a National Geographic magazine, and we shot some of the first stills and video footage of Greenland sharks under the ice. This is a shark that only lives in the north. It's as old as dinosaurs. It lives up to 500 years old. It has, its flesh is very toxic, so nobody really eats this animal, so it's one of the largest population of sharks on the planet. It also has antifreeze in its body, so it never forms ice crystals. You can do the next slide. And it's got a really great sense of smell. So it lives in about 2,000 feet of water, has teeth more like a nurse shark that actually eats bottom fish or bottom invertebrates. But they also think that it's an ambush eater, and they found seal in their stomach. And nobody really knows to this day how that's gotten there.
But this is actually discovery footage of animal behavior that had not previously been filmed.
Yeah, that's always what I'm trying. I mean, you know, it's getting harder and harder to find those nuggets. But yeah, this is another one. When I first went north, this is the Eastern Atlantic Walrus, and in the high Arctic, they usually eat clams, but it's about 3,000 to 5,000 feet deep, and there are no clams there. So this animal learned to hunt seals. And it learned to come behind seals that are like 900 pounds. It can hold it against its will with its big 4-flipper paws. And it can then, with one smack of its tusks, it basically takes its head off and sucks the brain and the fat right out of the seal. And the Inuit up there, my guides, were really scared of this animal because also when they're at the ice edge, they'll try to come up and grab the Inuit. So when I was in the water, they were yelling at me to get out of the water, but all I could see, again, in my head was Don Nelson and my aunt and uncle, I could see Story. Here was a monster, and I realized there wasn't that many walrus films that had been made, and there was virtually no footage of their underwater life, so I now decided to focus solely on walrus.
And that takes you on an incredible journey with the Inuit, and an incredible, I think, from what we've shared, discovery about the social structure of the walrus, and share that story and about the walrus hunt that you were on for your free ride to go film some walrus.
Well, initially when I started filming walrus, I didn't have any backing from anybody, so I was doing it out of pocket. And the way to do that was I would get permission from the Inuit to go on their hunts. So I would negotiate a couple hours to film, and they would hunt. And I went on a baby walrus hunt. For the Inuit, baby young walrus is like a delicacy like veal or lamb to us. But what I saw that day was pretty gut-wrenching. I always say when you get up close to an animal and you make some sort of a connection, sometimes it could be nice, sometimes it could be pretty dangerous, but also sometimes you can see the emotion in the animal. And when I think of animals, I just think of them as people. I don't really think I like to think of them as people because I'm trying to convey the similarities in my films that humans have to animals, because I think it's a better way to connect us to that animal. And so on the next clip, Phoebe, you can see I went on a walrus hunt. The intensity in this mother, the mother of this baby that the Inuit was hunting, was undeniable. It was tragic, but at the same time, it gave me the hook for my first film in the Arctic. So take a look at this.
And what actually happens, if you want to explain it, they harpoon it, and the mother, you're going to explain it as we go through it? I just want to make...
Well, I think the film will explain it.
Okay, good.
Okay. Maybe up the sound a little bit.
I will never forget the day I saw this firsthand. During one hunt, an Inuit harpooned a walrus calf. The mother immediately wrapped her flippers around the baby. They dragged them for 45 minutes, trying to pull them apart. She refused to let go. It was gut-wrenching. I was close enough to see the desperation in the mother's eyes and amazed by her intense devotion to her calf. The mother's behavior moved me so much that I wanted to film this intense bond, and they weren't being hunted.
So when I got that footage, or when it was on that hunt, I immediately wanted to go to National Geographic and pitch a walrus film, because I felt if I could figure out to find a mother and baby when they were sort of young and alone in their birthing grounds, that I might have a film. But nobody had ever filmed baby walrus. Nobody knew where the birthing grounds were. But in my pitch to National Geographic, I told them, oh yeah, I can find it, not a problem. And anyway, if you could look at this next clip, Phoebe, we could play it. I can talk through it. What I did, because I didn't really know how to, where to go, I went back to the Inuit, because they were the ones that always really helped me. They had the knowledge of the animal. And I found someone who grew up around walruses. In those days, we didn't have drones, so I wasted my entire aerial budget trying to find them in the pack ice, and we couldn't find them. But this guy, Pukka Kumanik, said he knew where to get them. But when he said that, I had no idea what I was getting myself into.
Not very good boating weather today.
Amazing, amazing footage.
I always say when you go into seasons that no one's ever been before, you can reveal and see things that are extraordinary. And the question, though, is what do you do with all that footage? And I was fortunate to, again, I felt like we had added knowledge to the archive, but I wanted to weave it in a narrative sort of film that really could connect the audience to that. And in the mid-2000s, I made a movie called Arctic Tale with Paramount Pictures and National Geographic, where we grew up a polar bear cub and a walrus calf for 8 years of their life. And they were the first generation to face a warming world. And they couldn't depend upon the patterns, the seasonal ice patterns that their parents had passed down to them. So they were facing them for the first time and just had to figure out how to survive. In this next clip, I'm going to introduce you to the main character of Arctic Tale, and we gave her a name. Her name is Sila, which is a Inuktitut for, it's an Inuit language for bright one. And she definitely is a smart one. And when we also filmed in the birthing grounds, we discovered another individual that, again, no one had really ever knew about, that the mother and the newborn have to help them. So let me play you the clip of Arctic Tale and introduce you to this third animal. Take a look. Phoebe, could you play the next clip, please? It's before that.
As we're waiting for this, one of the things that came out for me, you sharing with us, is the social structure of walruses could possibly be compared to the social structure of elephants with the family bond that's there. And I don't know that that had ever been really documented before you really started working with the walruses.
Yeah, I mean, I think marine mammals are very similar to us, especially ones that are very social and gregarious. Dolphin pods are very similar. Walruses have, like humans, have individual roles that really help for the betterment of the whole society. And so, play that clip. We'll introduce it to you.
Surface for 30 miles out is frozen into a hard sheet of ice. Just beyond lies the world of Sila's birth, a maze of ice floes that serves as a protected nursery. Here, a walrus mother can lavish care on her newborn pup. Using their sensitive whiskers, they memorize each other's face for life. That's right, those sweet stashes aren't just for style. But Sila has a second face to learn. Another female has been waiting to hear those first barks. Until Sila is old enough to face the world on her own. It's a 3-year commitment, starting now. It's going to be a long 3 years with this little handful. Auntie must wonder what she signed up for.
You can keep going, Phoebe. We'll keep playing. I worked a lot after Puckett showed me the birthing grounds of the Eastern Atlantic Walrus. He told me a lot about polar bears. And at the time, the scientific thought was that polar bears would never try to hunt a walrus, that it was only when it was really hungry or really desperate, because it's too big to take on. They're 4,000 pounds. They have these dagger-like tusks. And so I wanted to, though, go to these islands that Puckett told me about, where polar bears were showing up. And that meant that if I was gonna try to figure out if there were these events that happen where they come together, I was gonna have to become part of the food chain. I would go to these small islands about 100 miles from town, no fresh water, we'd bring fresh water with us. I first slept in tents, but I soon realized that I was basically a canvas-wrapped bear burrito. It was really kind of pure suicide to sort of live in a tent with the bear. And one of my first years doing this stakeout, I was woken up by a thing pushing on my head, and it was a polar bear's snout, and there was only a 1/4 inch of canvas between me and this 800-pound polar bear. And I did what everybody does when that kind of thing happens. I woke up my guide and I started whispering to him. I said, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" I nicknamed this bear the woofer because when he woke me up, he kind of had a sound of like this. It wasn't very pleasant, and but you can go back. Anyway, I was very taken by the Inuit, and that they were very patient. He woke up, Puckett, he put his rifle in his hands, and he just sat there and waited for the bear to make the next move. And then the bear did. He came in the front of the tent, and he pushed the zipper of the canvas tent up. And that's when, I kind of kept whispering. It was my horror film training, I guess. And then he shot, but he didn't shoot the bear. He shot up in the ceiling to scare it away. And that's how incredibly confident he was and patient. It actually caused the bear to go away, but now we had a round that echoed in our ears. We peeked out through the tent door, and it was about 30 feet away, and we made a mad dash for our boat. But in this next shot, the tide was out and our boat was beached. So that didn't work out very, very well. The bear eventually made his way out, but I vowed that I would never please go to the next slide. I would never let this happen again, and of course we never wanted the next slide to happen. And maybe we can move off the next slide. Damage a bear does.
That wasn't you, right?
Maybe you can pause for a second there, Phoebe?
That wasn't you in the shot.
No, that wasn't me. No.
Okay. So you had a little bit more of a rigid structure you brought.
Yeah, the next season I came back with a prefabricated cabin. I call it the coffin. It was basically good for 2 people. And it wouldn't, of course, stop a 1,000-pound polar bear, but it would warn you and wake you up in the middle of the night. Nights were the worst. And these stakeouts, I call them, were 6 weeks for the average stakeout. I did about 6 to 8 of these over the years. And you would get up at 3 in the morning when first light. You go to bed at dark, 9 p.m. You would try to survive the night, and then you would do a repeat. You can play the video clip now, please. And the whole idea is, in one way, it looks like you're just standing around doing absolutely nothing, except you're intensely always watching. You're waiting. You don't want a bear to sneak up around you. What if a new bear comes on the island? And of course, the bear goes for the walrus. But often the bear that was there would go over to the walrus and just sit there. It's frustrating, but it's part of the waiting game, the stakeout.
This is the beginning of the waiting game. You just gotta wait and wait and wait and wait. What we can do is if the bear was to come, we can grab that wide shot and then try to get closer. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 in the morning, and it's been pretty much snowing non-stop. And the sun does help. It helps to keep yourself up psychologically, definitely, while you're waiting. We're hopeful.
Then what I did is what could seem unimaginable, and it seemed like a perfectly good decision at the time, but we were low on supplies, and my guide wanted to go back and resupply. But going back to town meant minimum of 4 days, and I had a lot of walrus, I had a polar bear, and I knew if I left, I would probably miss something, I would miss the shot. And so I told him that I was gonna stay. That sounded like a good idea. And you can pause for a second. Maybe in Inuit culture, you never tell another man what to do. And so he told me that he thought it was suicide. He said, this place is not for humans, but I stayed anyway. And it wasn't until, of course, he left with the boat over the horizon that I realized I was living alone with a 1,000-pound predator that had swam 100 miles to do one thing and one thing only, and that was eat something or someone. And so to try to protect myself, there was a tower that the Canadian government put on the island because the area around the island was very shallow and they didn't want boats to run aground. And so I practiced a series of time trials that I thought would be beneficial to me if a bear wouldn't leave me alone. And because the whole goal was I didn't want to shoot a bear and kill it because that would be like, why are you even there? That defeats the purpose. And at the same time, I didn't want to really scare it away off the island. I wanted it to hunt walrus, not me. So take a look at this clip at some of the strange things that I made up to do while I was on this island.
Being left alone, I got a bear on the beach over there. Walrus, coming back and did. See how it goes.
With no one like that box to be there. Wait, that's much you want to take my camera and get out of we're there.
That was a little fast, that clip. But if we slowed it down, you would have seen it.
But the bear does come to you, right? You do have an encounter with the bear.
Well, I ended up staying there for 2 weeks. My guy didn't make it back. And all the footage I captured was really, I was really excited by it because, again, it was all about, can we prove that these bears, some bears that live in the area actually specialize in hunting walrus? And it's not what the scientists thought, that it was out of desperation and hunger only. And all that footage ended up in the landmark television series Planet Earth. And I brought a clip for that today, so take a look.
Yeah, this is incredible.
The chance of his first meal in months is slipping away. He seems increasingly desperate. It's now or never.
You shot that.
So that was, yes, I did.
Wow.
And that was very, of course, gratifying. But what I wanted to do with Arctic Tales, I wanted to take the narrative I started with the birthing grounds of Sela and her mother and her auntie, and I wanted to carry that through. And I wanted to follow them to the summer haul out and show what it was like for a young seal in its first year at a summer haul out and some of the harsh realities they have to face. So some of the footage that I gathered through all the years of my stakeouts, I put into this sequence. So let's play it and take a look.
Approaches downwind. He slips in undetected. Sela makes for the water behind her auntie, but the bear grabs her. Auntie doesn't hesitate. She races back to save the youngster. Her courage allows Sela to escape to the sea. In an act of devotion, Auntie makes the ultimate sacrifice. Sela waits. But Auntie will not return.
aunt and uncle always said movies were meant to move people. So it's always the emotion. You're trying to strive for the emotion in the story, whatever it is.
One of the things that starts to happen, when you started, you're pretty much handheld camera with what you've got, and it's the older technology. We start to see technology actually advance that give you some advantages to get some shots and record some animal behavior that would have never been able to be recorded otherwise. So share with us what advances actually in technology allowed you to really start to get close and into the animals.
Technology just in the last 5 years, drones alone have changed what we're able to capture. I thought the first one I wanted to bring up was actually an old piece of technology that I just brought into our toolkit, and maybe you can go to the next slide there. And I mounted, maybe the next slide. Nope, maybe the slide before. Go ahead and play this video. That drone you saw there was actually the first single-blade electric drone. The great thing about it was I could get shots. This was a story about a teenage polar bear that was on its own on a long, hot summer, didn't get enough food to eat. And the great thing about that drone is it let you really stay with the same individual. The only problem is you could only go about 15 minutes with the battery. This was the toy that I brought with me to have pure fun with polar bears, but when it worked, you could get very unusual angles.
I can't imagine that shot had ever been. Nobody was ever able to get a shot like that of a polar bear and live to bring it back.
Well, that's underwater. Actually, it's interesting. You can get close sometimes and not get eaten. Sometimes. Above water, if you walked up to a polar bear, I think it wouldn't end well. And so I'm always, for me, it's about getting. I think from being from water, water is 800 times denser than air. So to see anything underwater, you've got to be close. But that, to me, reveals the intimacy of that animal. It also allows you to see the decision-making process that's going on. So if you look at any fictional film or series, the close-up is where the whole story is told. That's where the whole emotion is in the movie. So I'm always trying to think of weird tools or toys that I can use to capture the coverage of that. I also just want to say the music that was in that last little bit was composed by somebody in the audience here, Mike Page, one of my guests.
Oh, fantastic.
So I appreciate that.
Fantastic. Now this is what, a gyro-stabilized camera we've got here?
This is something called the shot over. This is something that's brand new. I didn't have this toy when I was a kid. I wish I did. But it's a 6-axis gimbal stabilization rig. So there's times when you can't reach an animal or the behavior with being on a traditional tripod. So imagine if you were, go to the next slide, inside this housing called shot over, there's this camera. The cameras that we're shooting in wildlife now are 8 times that of high definition television. So it's 8,000 lines of resolution by 6,000. And that's a 1,000-millimeter lens. So when you zoom in on a 1,000-millimeter lens, you just know from when you look through binoculars, sometimes it's hard to keep them still. And so with that gyro-stabilized rig, you could be in 20-foot seas and the images are rock steady. Let's go to the next one. And so for this particular sequence that really hadn't been shot until about 5 years ago, we mounted the gyro-stabilized rig on the boat, on the bow, and go to the next one. And we went to this area, which seems like nothing could really live here. It's just a big boulder field. And there weren't any walruses here. So what was the polar bear doing? And I was really interested in capturing things during ice-free summer. So let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, I think you got it.
In low tide, it's not very good boating weather. I've said that before, haven't I? Sorry. It's not very good boating weather, and you would think that nothing could actually hunt here. Go to the next one. But as you look a little bit closer, what happens at high tide, go to the next one, is that the water will actually cover the rocks. It's not very much. It's only about 6 feet deep there. But that's deep enough for another animal that arrives to the very same place as the polar bear arrived to when the ice moves out. Take us to the next slide, please. Now, every year, thousands of beluga whales come to these shallow water rivers to molt their skin and give birth to their babies. But the one thing that nobody really knew about is they're there to eat a big summer feast. There's a fish called capelin. And until I got into the water, nobody really filmed them eating the fish before. So take a look at this. And go to the next slide, Phoebe. So this situation lined up really perfectly. The ice leaves, the tide drops, the bears show up, the belugas show up, the capelin show up. Everybody's happy, I guess. And then on one, again, another waiting period of going through a lot of tide cycles. When the tide rose, we captured something extraordinary, but we couldn't have done it without that shot over, that gyrostabilis rig. So take a look at this next video clip.
Animal on Earth better at it than the polar bear. And in the high tide of the land of the midnight sun, Adam captured the surreal technique that polar bears use to survive the ice-free summers.
This was just a little raw footage. It's coming out on a series this year on PBS, a fuller sequence of what we captured during that time with the polar bears and the belugas.
And it's amazing that the polar bear knows, I mean, when you looked at the number of rocks out there, and the polar bear knows what rock to stand on.
There's even, they use the same rock. So when there's a 4-hour tide cycle, they go to one rock and then they swim to the other rock on the upcoming tide, or the afternoon tide. So
yeah, again, so
they know exactly.
Yeah, the intellect and the logic, because that's not something that is an instinctual, part of the polar bear where they go to this rock. They've got to figure that out and know which rocks to be on.
But I think there's just kind of like humans again. If you live by a herd of wildebeest, you might eat wildebeest. And
right.
If you live by Vons, you're going to eat what's in Vons. and I think different polar bears specialize just in different food sources. And I think knowledge has been passed on for millennia, generations.
Yeah. One of the other things with the polar bears that you captured, which when I saw that I was just amazed, was this whole cliff climbing, hunting birds. And I've never seen that before.
Yeah, so I made a 3D polar bear film after Arctic Tail, and I tried to shoot it natively. So you do one camera for the left eye, one camera for the right eye to mimic 3D. And it's much more complicated than that. But anyway, most of the rigs weigh about 100 pounds. And so all I really wanted to do was to live up to a standard nature film. And I didn't really think I would capture something unusual. I followed the polar bear in this region where it was a teenager. In the polar bear world, at age 3, you're a teenager. You're kicked out of the house, not 18 like us, so that is a difference. But you're kicked out of the house. You're on your own. And this particular film, the seal, the teenager hadn't got enough to eat before the ice disappeared, and it had to survive a long, hot summer. We came by this cliff, this bird cliff. There's 50,000 pairs of thick-billed murs. This is a bird that's just like a penguin. It can swim underwater, but it also can fly in the air. Saw a polar bear. The scientists had seen them, but only to really scare them away, they were coming to their cabins. And so in this one, where I was doing stakeouts before, where you would do 6 weeks and wait for this one moment to happen, you also have to be ready when you come around the next chunk of ice or the next rock, because something extraordinary can be happening, and you have to capture it. You might only have 2 hours to do it. So take a look at this next clip, the scene we got in the 3D movie.
The scent he's picked up? Thick-billed murs. But there's 200 meters between him and it. It's a challenge no sensible adult bear would go for. Leave it to a desperate team. The murs pick cliffs for their colonies to keep predators from approaching. The ledges are just enough purchase. Nobody expects a cliff-climbing polar bear. This is behavior never before captured on video. The question is, for all the risk, work, is it worth it? Not for one chick. Bones and feathers are a recipe for starvation. Ice bear needs fat.
Incredible, absolutely incredible.
That was before we had drones and the shot over. It'd be great to have those tools now.
So how did you get those?
We shot from boats and on the cliffs with ropes, and we had the electric. We did have that single blade helicopter
Okay.
to get the bear climbing up the cliff.
Okay, and there was also a sequence you said with fox?
Right. Well, so in this story, the emphasis was on the polar bear. He was starving. He was desperate. He was hungry. We didn't give much credence to the murs. What do they go through? And in Arctic Tale, because it was a feature-length film, we had more time. So at the rock haul out where you saw Auntie Sela's aunt get sacrificed, we had more time to set that whole scene up. And first we bring the walrus, and the bear had arrived earlier knowing that the walrus were showing up. But down the coast was a bird cliff. And when you're waiting for something to happen and a fox shows up, you don't not shoot it. You shoot everything. Because there's always an opportunity that it could have a great payoff. And in using narrative conventions, I like the idea that you can still go off on a tangent with another story as long as it supports the through line of your main characters. And so I looked at the fox and the thick-billed murs, again, as people. They're just people trying to survive. And what we saw was extraordinary act or decisions that are made when you really get close and intimate in these birds. Unbelievable. So why don't we take a look at it and see what occurred.
Might not be so deep if they knew who had reached the island before them. The male bear. And where there's a bear, he's a local fox, dressed in summer camouflage. On Rock Island, he doesn't really need leftovers. There are more bird chicks than he can possibly eat. There's nowhere to run. And they're still too young to fly. Caught between a fox and a hard place, a mer father makes a remarkable request. The leap of faith inspires the entire flock. One youngster finds refuge in the sea. Another in the nick of time on a rare raft of ice. Nanu has paddled for days and grown so exhausted that she nearly drowned. This tiny place to rest has saved her life.
So, when you were filming that, did you know what you were going to get? Where these chicks were getting pushed off the edge by their father? Had you seen that?
Well, I mean, in the 80s, long before I got involved in this business, there was the BBC had made an incredible series of foxes going after not mer chicks, another chick, another bird. So you know these things can happen, and the Inuit have knowledge of this that they've seen. But when you go after a sequence, you have, you know that nature is always in charge. So you kind of make your best guesstimate of when to be there, and then you've got to be there.
Right.
And you've got to invest the time. And
right.
More time in the field, usually you get better footage and better sequencing.
Let's move on to the mystical narwhal and what your journey with them and what you've discovered about their behavior.
The drone is sort of this last piece of technology we wanted to share, but the narwhal, if you can go to the next slide. The narwhal is a whale, about an 18-foot whale that has sprouts a 9-foot tusk that comes right out of its head. And the tusk is actually a tooth. Narwhals are born with 4 teeth in their mouth, and in the male, it almost always will come out of the upper jaw and the upper lip, and it can grow up to 9 feet long. And for centuries, nobody knew what they do with that tusk. They've seen them jousting, which is sort of like maybe dominance to attract a female, but nobody really knew what they use it for until drones, really. And the new drones the batteries last like 45 minutes. So what I love is I think the future, that's just gonna get longer and longer. And one day we'll be able to send a drone out for 8 hours and really sit on behavior and capture it. And I think that's one way natural history footage is gonna be captured in the future, of things we've never seen before. Using this drone, I sent it up, and we were able to actually show it doing one thing with it, having one purpose of the tusk. I never think there's just one thing it does with the tusk, but let's take a look at this next clip. This is, in fact, the narwhal sort of was the first animal that I originally went to the North back in 1990. It was my first trip to the high Arctic. And I got sidetracked by walrus and polar bears. But I'm kind of coming full circle again, and I want to make a film about narwhal. And the reason is, it's still one of the last animals. It's very skittish, very difficult to get close to. When all animals in the winter, when it's 50 below zero, all animals go south, it goes north. And it surrounds itself in an icy fortress, and in 14,000 feet of water has a refrigerator full of halibut and squid, and it's in paradise. And it's only when the ice begins to thaw and disappear is when it starts having troubles and challenges. So I want to spend about 2 to 4 years with trying to find new behavior and the life of the narwhal. And we brought a little trailer clip of the project that of the next project of the film we're going to make about narwhal.
Made it this far. We're about, what, 3,000 miles from New York City, north. A couple of plane rides, at least 3. 500 pounds of gear.
It takes a certain kind of person to go into the far reaches of our planet, places that still are untouched. Weathered in for 15 days.
This is my last testament. I've been trying to understand where I belong, and I've been searching the Arctic to ultimately find my meaning of home.
There you go.
So as we start to wrap things up here, what are you seeing? Just share with us, what are you seeing with the ice conditions, the changing conditions for the animals of the Arctic from your experience of being up there for the last 30 years?
Right. Well, I mean, the Arctic, I've even been reading reports that it's even warming 4 times faster than anywhere on the planet. The ice, that means the ice-free seasons, summer seasons are longer and longer, and it's going to be a challenge for all animals and people to adapt. The one thing that I love to try to do, like the ice, when you look at ice like this, for most people, I mean, you couldn't tell if that's healthy ice or good ice or bad ice, and I've always tried to figure out techniques to show, that the ice is disappearing, or to show how it forms. And so I just thought I'd end with just showing you a few techniques that, how I look at the ice as an animal. It's alive. And what's happening right now is we're losing it at an alarming rate. And the narwhal specifically, scientists think that they're so linked, their DNA, their ancient sort of connection to the ice is so dependent on it that if it goes, they would be in more trouble than a polar bear. But I also would like to think that all these animals are remarkable and will figure out a way to survive. So take a look at this next clip. I never like to show the ice not moving. I think it's more interesting to show it when it's a little chaotic and crazy. I think the most amazing, though, is when it's in the moment. It's the most dangerous and dramatic.
Oh man, this is what the Arctic's all about. Mostly weather.
A couple of nights of 20 below zero, it will freeze. And it just shows you how dependent everyone, people, the animals are on it and linked to it.
Incredible footage, incredible footage. What I'd like to do is we have some questions from the audience that we can take. And if Rich is, here comes Rich, he's going to pass the mic around so we get that recorded on YouTube. And we do have some hands going up, so you got Rich Abley right up front.
Yeah, Rich Abley, 1172. Please tell us the purpose of the narwhal's tusk. What's it used for, and did you and were you able to photograph it in use?
Right. Well, I mean, the only thing we now know is that it sometimes will use it to, I mean, we showed that it uses it to stun fish to feed. Other than that, I think that there's probably other uses, and that's what I hope we'll discover. But it's a challenging animal to stay with and to get close to. But that's the only purpose, yeah.
In the back there.
Did you have a favorite thing about filming in these projects, or a favorite animal to film?
I like polar bears, I like walrus, and I like narwhals. Everything for me is is linked to the water. It's for me, the diving is the drug, and keeping physical, because my baseball career didn't happen. But it's important to get in the water, and and I love, of course, shooting it and telling compelling stories.
Here we go, one more.
David McAlexander, 1199.
Yeah.
Question about what may happen with evolution as the ice goes away. Because one thing science is telling us is that evolution often happens quicker than we think. And I would argue today that a human predator looks unlike our ancestors 5,000 years ago. In any case, any speculation, or have you seen any evidence of stuff that how nature may fill the vacuum as one species is under pressure and a new species changes and steps in?
I mean, I don't think anyone really knows the full answer to that with the Arctic, but there are diets have already been changing in certain animals, and certain fish, the ranges are coming further north, so there could be new food sources, and some animals won't make it, so.
You mentioned that one time that your guide went back and left you alone, and it was a 4-day trip, and then you were like, oh yeah, then he was gone 2 weeks. I mean, that was like an extra 10 days. Wow, you did. I'm curious, a little more detail about that.
Did you fire?
Did you run out of food? Like that's.
No, so what I had food-wise, I brought a lot of freeze-dried packets. And I did that on purpose because I didn't want to cook. I didn't want to cook because I didn't want too much smell for the polar bear, although there was enough smell with the walrus if the wind was in the right direction. So they were getting their fill. And also, I just didn't want to have the time away from watching. I had at the very beginning when he left, the bear came, and I had to scare him away. What we always carry is a shotgun, and we have bear bangers, which is basically like a firecracker, and we then have rubber ammo after that, and then we have the real thing. But again, so I spent a lot of time scaring the bear away. I spent a lot of time on that, like 8 feet in that tower, as he would pass underneath. And then at night was scary. It was very scary, yeah.
So Jeff Nages, I want to thank you for a remarkable presentation. I have 3 questions. So the last one first is, the last snippet that you showed us was sort of like the last exploration. Is that your final movie, sort of the eclipse of your...
Well, it's kind of the narwhal would be coming full circle, and it's an animal that still, even with all the, what's amazing is there's so many cameras in the wild now, which is fantastic, because I think it's a period of time, the last 4 decades has really been, we have learned so much, because even in many ways been ahead of the science, because the funding for these big television series keeps people out there shooting. So the narwhal is kind of my last big Arctic show, but I'm sure when that comes to an end, I'll have another Arctic.
My second question is about walruses.
Yeah.
Do they only give birth to one at a time, and what is the gestation period?
It delays, and it's about 13 months. So that it can be, so it can target the spring and give birth in the ice at that time.
But they only give birth
to one animal, yeah.
And are polar bears solitary creatures? Do they live in packs?
That's the whole, the stereotype is that they're alone all the time, and they roam, looking for food. But like I said, I think of them more as clans. I think that even this idea that when they're a teenager and they get kicked out of the nest, they know each other for their whole lives. That's my and sometimes they're alone, and sometimes they show up, at the barbecue party at the Walrus Hall Lab. And they get together and talk, and share their experiences. So.
We'll take one more in the back here.
Yes, hi, Chaz Clivens, I'm a guest. Fantastic presentation. You talked to us about your outer journey, and I'm sensing that there's an inner journey as well. And could you just share a little bit how this has changed you on your inner journey?
I don't want to talk about emotions, okay? That's where you're going. Oh, sorry, no. No, I mean, this has been an amazing journey, I think about where I came from, I first learned to dive off San Diego, and I'm under the ice, but it's more, I think one of the more richer parts of my journey has been getting to know the Inuit people. And I was very lucky that in the Canadian culture, in the Canadian Inuit, they formed an alliance with the Canadian government and formed their own territory. It's called Nunavut. And that only got formed in 1960. So most of the guides I was working with and the women that were sewing, were making the clothing and in that community had all got to about age 10 or 12 on the land and then moved into the communities. But they still were trained the same way that Inuit had been trained for 5,000 years on the land. And so I feel quite privileged to have had this window into this remarkable culture, and that's been a big part of my growth.
Well, Adam, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Adventures Club for taking the time to come in and share this incredible footage with us, and share your incredible story. And I think that there's going to be an opportunity for you to come back and share more footage and more stories, as time goes by. But thank you for coming in here, because this is the heart of what we're about, is being off the beaten path and bringing that back to people and realizing that there's a much bigger world out there than paved freeways. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.